spiritual intercession usually is called for. Finally finishing with part 5, or movement 5, and here there's some kind of comment about the problems of artistic wholeness and achieving some notion of spiritual health. As we get into these poems, this is a great schemata for us, right? The poem actually, for Eliot, Bert Norton, begins with a couple of quotes from the great philosopher, pre-Socratic philosopher, Heraclitus, right? And Heraclitus said, right, he's the guy that said, you can't ever step into the same river twice because the river is constantly flowing, right? There's two quotes that we want to pay attention to here. And the first one is this, in translation: the law of reason, or logos, is common. The majority of people live as though they had an understanding, wisdom of their own. This will be significant in our understanding of the ways in which Eliot's going to argue that we find ourselves in fixes sometimes, and ironically, we don't look for help outside of ourselves, which is kind of ironic. The second quote from Heraclitus is a fundamental paradox. He says it this way: the way upward and downward are one and the same, end quote. Now, we're going to chart these ideas from the very beginning of Bert Norton all the way through all 4 of the poems. Of course, the big question of the 4 quartets, let's go ahead and write that down. You know how I like to sometimes give you a big question and then we'll get into the weeds. The big question is, what's the point of life? For example, watch this. I'm going to give you a few quotes from the poem just to see what you think. From Dry Selves Ages, part 2, movement 2. Dry Selves Ages, again, the 3rd poem of the 4 quartets. He says it this way. I think this is one good way to think about these poems. He says, we had the experience, but missed the meaning. We had the experience, but missed the meaning. Think about the ways in which we could argue, and we'll mention this again in a bit. Your senior year, you might say about your high school experience, we had the experience, but maybe somehow missed the meaning. How do you qualify the meaning? So there's lots of different ways to approach these poems. I actually want to start, though, with the way that I'm going to approach the poems with you. And this one is going to take us to East Coker, poem number 2, part 5. At the very end of that poem, he says it this way: so here I am, in the middle way. Well, think of Dante's, of course, Inferno and Divine Comedy Inferno, the opening lines, right, of Inferno, Dante in the middle way. Having had 20 years largely wasted, we immediately think with the word waste of the poem Wasteland, right, of 1922. The years of l'entre-deux-guerres. Now, this is a French word which is usually translated as between the wars. I like to think that this may be the central kind of key to unlocking the 4 quartets. As I've taught these poems for many years, I think there's something here that's really important. Of course, the 20 years between the wars, quite literally, we'll get to in a moment, are the time between World War I and World War II. But I want to take you, and I hope this doesn't sound too ironic, I want to take you to Homer's Odyssey. Remember our comments on Homer's Odyssey, right? And you'll remember that Odysseus goes down into the underworld where Tiresias tells him, uh-oh, you got some bad things coming. One of the bad things that he says is coming is you're going to have to sail your boat with your sailors through this area between 2 nasty kind of situations. One is the monster Scylla. The other is this disgusting kind of whirlpool monster called Charybdis. You're going to have to find a way to go through them. Our comment, or our cliche statement, being between a rock and a hard place, when you are kind of stuck between 2 choices and none of them work. Think about our study in the Harvard Classics, for example, of Greek drama, right? The Sophoclean, I mean, all of them, Euripides, all of them would do this, where often they would put a character on stage on the horns of nasty dilemma. I mean, Orestes, for example, think about that, right? With our study of Aeschylus. What's he going to do, right? How is he going to respond? I think that this struggle between 2 tensions or 2 wars is central to how we read 4 quartets. And I'm going to recommend 3 of these struggles, and we're going to try and plot them as we go through our study. The first is a political struggle. We've already mentioned it, obviously. World War I, 1914 to 1918, and World War II, 1939 to 1945, and those are 20 years right in between. But I think there's another war that scholars have pointed out that is always in the back of the mind of T.S. Eliot as well, and that's the English Civil War of a few years prior. We can go back to our Harvard Classics lectures on Milton to hear more about that and the tension there with Areopagitica and all of that. I think the other tension maybe that comes to mind politically is the tension between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Of course, we can think about the tension even before that, of the tension between the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance, and then finally the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, or Romanticism and the Industrial Revolution. Think about Wordsworth's "The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending we lay waste our powers, little we see in nature that's ours." That tension between, on the one hand, understanding and evaluation of and appreciation of nature, and on the other hand, the Industrial Revolution. Or the classical world versus the modern and then later the postmodern world. I think all of these are struggles or tensions, and I think one way to think about the four quartets at the political side is T.S. Eliot is aware, acutely aware, that he is in the middle between two different kinds of political struggles that are ongoing, right? The question here in the political struggle is, what's wrong with us? Why do we, for example, keep fighting the same political battles over and over again? Why can't we find a way to resolve conflict more intelligently than dropping rocks on each other's heads, the way, of course, Jack will do it to Piggy in Golding's Lord of Flies, and hurrah, they're saved at the end of the novel, but wait, saved by who? Well, adults. Not just any adults, military men, who are doing what? Well, they're practicing to drop rocks on each other's heads in conflict resolution. Namely, of course, bombs, right? Golding wrote Lord of Flies, his concern of the rise of the nuclear age, okay? The answer that Eliot will provide in his political analysis is something is missing. So write that down. Something is missing. Namely, we said it already, the meaning, the value. Okay? Well, if there is a political struggle between two wars, I think there's also a literary struggle, right? Behind, we've already said it, behind T.S. Eliot, constantly in his mind are all those great poets. Homer and Virgil, of course, the great epic writers. Augustine's Confessions, as well as City of God. Dante, we've already said, huge. Milton, right, as we've already said. You'll remember, Milton said that he was going to attempt things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. Certainly, of course, T.S. Eliot is aware of the ways in which Milton is trying to one-up. Can T.S. Eliot one-up, right? Wordsworth, Coleridge, of course, are going to be in his mind, as well as, I believe, Whitman, and the romantic influences that are there as well. And even though at times Eliot would speak against some of these writers, I think they're all highly influential. And so there's a struggle for T.S. Eliot. Eliot knew that there was no going back. He was living in a skeptical age that was going to remain skeptical, but he wants to rival, or at least represent, all of the preceding voices. And to that degree, I think he's caught in the middle of the battle as well, right? We're going to study this at level 2B quite a bit. We're going to look at major symbols. Okay, so you want to write that one down. Poetic techniques, like, for example, repetition or echo. We're going to see this a lot in these poems. It's quite fascinating how he does this. He will say it, "My words echo thus in your mind." And we're going to see this from one poem to the next. There's kind of like returning back to earlier ideas and motifs, right? We're going to see how Four Quartets then is in many ways a response to the Wasteland, as we already said. And again, be sure that you have studied the Wasteland with me, because we're going to make a lot of references back to the Wasteland in lectures and lines from the Wasteland. All right. Well, if there is a struggle between two wars, between the political, between the literary, I think that the third struggle, and this one I think is really important for us, it's the spiritual struggle. Notice I'm not saying that this is a religious struggle, although many have tried to frame it in that way, because T.S. Eliot is a Christian, but he is a Christian who is as well able to respect other non-Christian faiths, right? Namely, we're going to see in this poem, Hinduism and Buddhism. He assumes, by the way, that you know the Bhagavad Gita, as he talks about Arjuna and Krishna, and will obviously help you through that, right? So, what kind of wars are we talking about when we talk about the spiritual struggle? Well, obviously the wars between birth and death, right? We've said this before, right? You and a fly are only different in that you know about fly swatters. Everything else is pretty much the same, but that difference is monumental. Or we said before. That they were teaching you this when you went to the park as a young kid, swinging and playing at the park. It's time to go to the van. You want to go to the van, you've got to go to the van. You can't swing at the park forever. Everybody's got to go to the van. That fact informs this spiritual struggle, this spiritual tension. Think of it this way. T.S. Eliot was aware of Plato's 4 virtues. You'll remember them from our lectures, right? Wisdom, courage, temperance or discipline, and justice. And these are all hypercritical. But T.S. Eliot was also aware that St. Augustine said there are the Pauline virtues of St. Paul: faith, hope, and love. And those 7 virtues taken collectively have to define what the well-lived life is going to look like. But for T.S. Eliot, because he's Christian, the most significant of all of those 7 virtues is love. And we'll obviously get to that one. Pay attention to the way love gets used in this work. You could do worse than to simply have a copy of 4 quartets, and every time the word love gets used, just highlight it and ask, what's going on with his use of this word? Right. Think about as well, because Dante is so important, think about as well this notion of the spiritual notion for Dante of Dante the poet versus Dante the pilgrim. Dante puts himself in the actual poem of Divine Comedy as a pilgrim, as a person who is taking a long journey, right? You can think about Eliot in similar ways. Eliot the poet versus Eliot the pilgrim. Old men should be explorers, he will say. And this idea of Eliot as pilgrim, I think, feeds right into this notion of the spiritual struggle, right? And I think this understanding of not just a political or a literary tension or struggle, but being between as well as spiritual struggle, is the reason why people continue to read this poem and somehow grow from this poem. I mean, think of it. We said it already. 4 years ago, right, you were a freshman. The journey of your high school career is kind of like a small life, we might say. But again, the lines come back. We had the experience, but missed the meaning. Or, how about this line? In my end is my beginning. All right, let's finish now briefly by outlining the actual 4 poems of 4 quartets, and again, more detailed in lectures to follow at learnstrong.net in the Senior B folder, right? Let's first of all just say it out loud for your notes. These 4 poems are poems of place. Think Wordsworth's lines composed about Tintern Abbey, as we talked about place. And all 4 poems are named after some kind of significant place. The first poem, Bert Norton. There's this really cool old mansion with a really neat garden out behind it, and that's where we're actually going to start. In Bert Norton, we're going to introduce ourselves to concepts of time. We're immediately going to think about Confessions, chapter 11. Go back to the Harvard Classics lecture 57 for comments on that one. The challenge of the present and how to live in the present will all be a part of our study of Bert Norton. East Coker is an area of England where we're going to have an old church. We're going to have a very interesting kind of like dance ceremony that's going to be played with out in the countryside, if you will. T.S. Eliot's ancestors came from East Coker, right? And ultimately, it's where his ashes are located at St. Michael's, as we said, right? Here in East Coker, we're going to hear about the quest to connect with nature, right, in some kind of present moment. The third poem is called the Dry Selves Ages. Now, this one is important, so write this in your notes. We'll come back to it. The Dry Selves Ages is the one place that's celebrated in the titles of 4 quartets that's not English. It's actually American. It's a rock formation out in the ocean, just off the off the coast of Cape Ann, Massachusetts. And there's a church that's referenced right there as well. And here we're going to hear about the spiritual quest to somehow overcome and release our egos and connect somehow with a larger whole. This is that whole discussion and tension between the psychology, the individual mind, and sociology, group minds. The final poem is called Little Gidding. It's, again, another really cool little church. By the way, I really do recommend that before you study each of these, just do a Google image search and take a look and see what these look like so you have a sense in your mind. I mean, obviously I would recommend that if you ever get the chance to go to England, that you visit, 3 of the 4 places that are named here, right? Little Gidding, by the way, is the most anthologized of the 4 poems, and it is really a poem about self-reform and the ways in which you can only reform the world if you begin by reforming yourself. And the quest for somehow a new language, because Eliot was aware that the old words no longer work. Okay? Now there's a final way that I want to introduce you that scholars have thought about for quartets, the joining of Christian theology, Augustine, Dante, Milton, as we mentioned, with the pre-Socratics and the elements of that those pre-Socratics thought about. I mean, we mentioned Heraclitus already. Those four elements, remember, air, earth, water, fire. Heraclitus, and of course Plato himself, played sometimes with that game. And some scholars have pointed this one out, so put this one in your notes and let's see if this one works for you later when we go to work with the poems individually. Bert Norton will reference primarily God the Father and theological and the element of air. Okay? East Coker, the second of the poems, will emphasize God the Son, theologically, and the element of earth. The third poem, Dry Selves Ages, will theologically focus on Mary, of course the Mother of God in Christian theology, and the element emphasized is water. And finally, Little Gidding, the last of the four quartets, will emphasize theologically God as spirit, and the element emphasized is fire. Again, we're going to want to consider all of these approaches and many more as we get into this. Now, let's turn in lecture number 2 of our series of 5 lectures on the four quartets to Bert Norton. And we're going to do the same thing we did with our study of Wasteland. We're going to let the great actor Alec Guinness read for us, and then we'll pause at the end of each section, and we'll do the exact same thing we did with Wasteland, and we'll go through the information, right? Our quest, of course, is to find some ideas that challenge us, and it won't be hard. I mean, for example, just consider these lines. I'm just going to give you a couple of lines, just so as we finish this lecture, it will make you think, and then you'll go, well, maybe I will spend a little more time individually with each one of these texts. And again, I challenge you, read it on your own, do your own annotations, and then come back to me to help you with it. How about this line? Love is most nearly itself when here and now cease to matter. I'll read it again. Some of you are giving me cool looks. Love is most nearly itself when here and now cease to matter. From East Coker, part 5. We'll get to those lines later. How about this one? The time of death is every moment. The time of death is every moment. From Dry Selves Ages, part 3. Well, let's have a bit of fun, and let's go to work. Let's see what we can do to learn a little bit more about T.S. Eliot and the four quartets. Thank you.